Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversation with Masters. Today, I am in conversation with Thomas, the CEO and the founder of Wittigonia. I hope I
Yeah,
pronounce right.
that sounds
Thomas,
good.
welcome.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invite.
Please introduce yourself in the way you want and you feel most authentic to you.
Yeah, okay. So my name is Thomas Wittig. My career goes back to the late 80s, early 90s. I was studying at the Tech University in Munich, and I needed some money to fund my studies. So I signed up with a crazy startup, which I thought would never become a company. And that company would be Microsoft. And that was a really interesting time. I thought, okay, I did my thesis there and spent a year there working as a temp, and then I wrote my thesis. So one thing leads to another. And I thought, okay, I could work there for a year. And then I spent 15 years there. After that, for several other companies, including S.U.P., which is another big, well-known leader in the IT and software industry. Worked for several companies in high tech, mainly in C-level roles, and then eventually found my own company. Related to our topic here, I think here today we talk about systemic approaches in organization and business. In that regard, I came into that field in the early 2000s, I think was my first encounter in that field. So talk about that a little bit later. But what I'm doing basically mainstream is I work in the digital strategy, data analytics, and I call it also system dynamics field. In addition to that, I'm doing some teaching about systemic approaches for people and leaders in organization.
Huge background, right?
Yeah, it's been a while now. So when I look back at the years, I'm sometimes surprised myself what about all the things that happened. But I mean, if you spend more than 3 decades in the industry, eventually you will do a lot of different things. No? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. I have some question for you and some curiosity. What is system dynamics modeling, and why it's important in the complex markets?
Yeah, that's a very good topic. I want to mention these two streams I was following, right? One is called system dynamics modeling, and the other one is usually referred to as systemic approaches in organization. So let's talk about the first one. System dynamics modeling. How did I come to that? In the late 90s, or let's say around 2000, I found myself in increasing complex roles. At that time in Microsoft Corporation, things grew very rapidly and complexity increased. And then I thought, okay, there must be a better way to manage complexity. First, I kind of discovered the art of systems thinking. But for me, being a data-driven and process-driven guy, that was necessary but not sufficient. I wanted to go deeper. So then I discovered the School of System Dynamics. At the time, it was actually founded by J. Wright Forrester in the 50s, 60s. The School of Thought in MIT. And I thought, okay, this is really interesting because what we do there is we model problems, complex problems with the tool set, typically called system dynamics tools, which consists of feedback loops, stock and flow diagrams. It's a fairly quantitative work if you want it, and I really like the quantitative work. So I took a deep dive into that. I did a master in system dynamics modeling. And I have to say, just lately, in the last years, actually, it became really relevant when we went through all the craziness of all the things that are hitting us right now. No? The pandemic, the climate crisis, increasing complexity on the global economy scale, but also in organizations. For example, adoption of technology is a classic case which you can better understand with this tool set of system dynamics. No? So that's how a lot of things came together for me. That's the side of system dynamics. It's a quantitative approach. The other side came to me in a kind of the equal time frame, I would say, in the early 2000s. I realized that including myself, we sometimes hit a ceiling in our own development, and we cannot break through from that. And that has to do more with I would call it the inner game. Not necessarily with the quantitative dynamics, but with the soft factors, the inner game. So I had the pleasure to meet another founder of a different field. His name was Bert Hellinger, and he was the pioneer in systemic approaches in families. And I realized this is really interesting in the context of groups in organizations, for example. So I kind of followed these two paths until they kind of made sense and connected for me. So these are kind of my two tracks I followed over the years.
Yeah, so now many leaders they speak about KPI. They try to have this form of KPI better and better, I guess. So the curiosity what I like to ask you is how do KPI dashboards support systemic awareness instead of just reporting numbers?
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic. It's actually also topic of a forthcoming blog post I'm writing right now about how to make more sense out of your numbers. No? So obviously, I have seen a lot of dashboards. I have built a lot of dashboards. I have tried to interpret a lot of dashboards and course correct it. And a couple of observations I found over the years. One is that sometimes the numbers don't add up. They don't connect. Okay. And oftentimes the dashboards are not very decision oriented. In my view of the world, my new view of the world is I like to use a dashboard to better understand how things flow through the enterprise. For example, by things, I mean money, people, projects, information, sometimes rumors, right? Things like that. And that's where I apply a lot the system dynamics modeling to make a dashboard more stock and flow consistent so that people really can understand how things hang together. Okay? The other discipline, when we talk about the inner game basically, when something is out of order, it articulates itself in the organization, often in the area of what we call organizational health. And the symptoms of an organization which is out of balance, out of health, are typically inferior satisfaction of the stakeholders, the employees, for example, okay, or high fluctuation rates, absenteeism, and things like that. So I think in the new world that we live in, also the post-pandemic new world, it's really worthwhile taking a fresh look at the dashboards to figure out, does it tell us something about the systemic nature in one hand, the inner fabric, the inner game of the organization? Is it a reflection of the state of the soul of the organization, really, literally? But also the quantitative aspects. Do we understand why things suddenly take off or collapse, and what is preceding that, for example?
Yeah, many insights with you, Tom. I must to tell you that. And now we shift a little bit in another topic, very interesting, and I hope here you have a lot to say too. So, how do digital growth, data intelligence, and systemic dynamics work together as one system?
Yeah, it's another great topic. No? So I think the golden rule in system dynamics for me, and I think it's also shared by a lot of people in academia and in the practical practitioner side, is systems thinking, systems dynamic has to go together with data from the real world. Otherwise, it's becoming a kind of a little bit more lost in beauty, I would say. No? But we use system dynamics to solve a certain category of problems, especially those problems which are complex in nature and which have to deal with dynamics and change over time. By that, I mean, for example, how does a workforce grow or decline over time? So we need data in order to calibrate our models to the real world. And we do that often for example, policy testing, optimization, or forecasting in the sense of understanding how a system behaves under different conditions when it's triggered. An example for that is a shock in a supply chain. It could be a physical supply chain, but it could also be a labor supply chain. labor is kind of a really ugly word. It basically means like people joining the organization, for example. So we need to work with data. And I think the beauty about this day and age is that we not only have the wealth of data, but we also have the opportunities with AI, with large language models, to better understand data and to even create data if you want. So this goes hand in hand. I think this is another new golden age in the area of data and system dynamics. And as I mentioned before, I believe we have seen a renaissance of system dynamics. No? System dynamics is actually an old field. It started in the 50s, 60s, no? And people were working on world models and other really interesting things. But now we see how useful it can be in the pandemic, for example, no? Or today, closure of the Strait of Hormuz. No? What does it mean in terms of the supply chains, energy prices, and so on? That's where you can use system dynamics to understand the implications.
Many person around the globe, they speak about artificial intelligence, and actually we live in this moment of the history. With 20 years you can have your personal agent AI, right? And he can make for you many different things. But in the same time, because you look in this area of marketing, I would like to ask you, how do AI driven marketing system influence organizational structure and leadership behaviors, maybe?
How do marketing systems influence leadership behavior?
Organizational structure and leadership behaviors.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that you can observe, starting, for example, with small business or startups, all the way up to large enterprises, is the problems typically start not when companies become unprofitable, but when they have cash flow problems. So, cash flow is ultimately linked to the product market fit, pricing strategies, positioning, etc. That's where I think our marketing decisions really have a lot of impact. Winning customers, retaining customers, and, for example, growing lifetime value of customers. If you have a compelling offering that people love, and I give you an example literally, right? Take a company like Lovable, for example, a Swedish company, AI company. They have built a truly lovable product. People love it. They create new artifacts from that, like apps, websites, whatever, right? And their MRR is growing through the roof. So that's a good example where I believe they hit the nail on the head and produced a product which has a good product market fit, but also a very attractive price value proposition. So that's where you can see where something is really taking off. And similar to other phenomena, they go S-shaped growth curve is very, very steep, obviously. No? And I'm very happy for them. I follow their activities. I think it's a great team. And it's also an innovation coming out of Europe. I think that's also very special. But just the growth story alone is very interesting. And there you see how this positioning and marketing related decisions are very important. No? Marketing for me is not about advertising, etc. I do a lot of advertising and digital marketing optimization, which is important, but it's not helpful if you don't have a good product market fit. No? Almost, I would say, if you have a good product, you can almost forget about advertising because the product kind of sells itself through word of mouth propagation. No?
Yeah, and actually, I think now we are in the beginning of this era of IE. Like in the 90s, if you speak to one of your friend and say, "Hey, I'll be influencer," in the 90s, people, they start to laugh, about it. Hey, go to work, take a real job, right? So the comparison, yeah, it's something similar now with artificial intelligence. There are many startups, they blow up in the beginning because something new and stuff. So yeah, but with the time, this will be just a game changer, if you want.
Yeah.
Tom, now for the listeners, if they would like to come in contact with you, what is the best channel for you?
Yeah, well, you can find me on LinkedIn, but my website is called wittigonia.net. Maybe we can put it in the show notes. From there, I'm basically advancing in these three areas, no? Digital, data, and dynamics. And sometimes I'm doing very specialized inner game workshops. The next one is coming up in Sao Paulo in Brazil in May. So people in the region and beyond are invited to attend. This is specifically for applying inner game systemic approaches to leadership and helping people in organization. Big topic right now is, of course, around adoption of AI. That's kind of a different line of business I have started to create. The website for that is constellateur.com. It looks already very different. And I think for listeners who want to explore that, we can put it in the show notes.
Yeah, actually, you asked me, from where? Now I remember your website too. You have many free videos there, many details about systemic leadership and work. And now I remember that website too, actually.
Yeah. That's actually, I think this is for me more a community service where I'm trying to pass on things that I experienced that worked for me in certain situations, and I'd like to pass that on to the next generation of leaders or people who could use it in their daily life. And again, I think the inner game and the quantitative have to go hand in hand. So there is no movement in the organization if the resonance in the organization doesn't work. And likewise, if you just have a happy team and everything is in resonance, but you don't have a handle on the quantitative side of the business, you're also not going to get very far. That's something I really realized actually much later in my career, that these two are ultimately interlinked to each other.
It's very nice you pick up the systemic leadership. And another question what I have for you, and of course for the listeners, maybe they would like to understand better this. How do systemic leadership differ from traditional executive leadership? What is the difference?
Yeah. So actually, before we go there, I totally forgot about that. I created what I call the systemic leadership quiz or test. Okay, it's a very short free test where you can answer some question to test your awareness, and it spits out some result, and you get a free email sequence. It's just free of charge. It's more a community service, no? But I also got some really interesting insights out of that. No, one of which is that we often think that we do understand what are, for example, the underlying systemic orders in organizations. No, so for example, who has a higher priority? No? We look sometimes at the organizational chart and we think, okay, the person on top, whatever gender or whatever he, she, they are in charge. But when you are coming into an organization as a new leader, for example, and you don't know the inner fabric and the systemic orders in an organization, and you start with the wrong people, the ones who really matter, they will show you this body language, right? They go like this and they say, okay, let him try or her try and see how far she gets. No? And that is a good example where it makes a lot of sense to take a little detour and really understand what are these systemic inherent orders in an organization and how can they get out of balance. And then back to your question, what can be the role of leadership to rebalance an organization and create an environment which restores the resonance and where people can thrive in the organization, where they actually want to work in the organization, want to make a contribution, want to pursue a purpose, which is the big topic these days. We are more in a purpose-driven economy and society than ever before. So that's why I think the systemic leadership also matters a lot. It's just one area. No? In the workshop that we mentioned, I sometimes also do exercises with people in how they present themselves. How do they present themselves, their offer, their value proposition, and the price? That's what people struggle a lot with, no? Especially people in helping professions like consultants or coaches and the like.
It's very easy. Just say always call me, and everything will be,
Yeah, well,
in
if
the
it
way.
would be that easy, then you would not have so many companies not making it, no? I'm looking, for example, especially at the young organizations, the startups. We have a very high failure rate, no? But if we want to make a difference and address the key problems in the world today, energy, climate, peace, whatever, like complex things, we do need a lot of innovation, a lot of good ideas, like the Lovables of the world, like the OpenAI, Anthropics of the world, etc. No? So we need to figure out a way to build the ground for these organizations, for the innovation to thrive.
Yeah, some maybe some investors they know already when they invest in these kind of companies, and actually I speak with some angel investors. They know from the beginning they invest in 5, 6 companies at the same time, and they say, okay, if one of them will make us, what we invest this year will be amazing, will be fantastic. So it's a game from them too. And about the game, I would like to ask you, how do you integrate the rational data driven thinking with a deeper systemic awareness?
Yeah, that's probably a topic for a longer discussion or maybe even a seminar. No? That's why we do the seminars. I have to say, it took me also a long time. It was not so obvious for me. And I think it became much clearer to me when I found myself also in the situation of passing my knowledge on forward to explain how I'm doing this, because that's when you're forced to make your implicit knowledge, your own or your tribal knowledge, transparent. No? And that helps you. You become actually a new learner in that way when you start to teach. No? And I started some, let's say, educational things here in the local university and in my own seminars about, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago. That's when I realized, okay, I have to find a better way to even reflect on how I'm working and make that available to others. No? So, but in every situation, I usually draw from different fields and areas, no? Not only the two that I just mentioned, but obviously from my own experience, for example, in the high-tech industry or when I'm working with growth oriented enterprises, mainly in the larger European area or worldwide. And I'm trying to figure out what does, the first question is always, what does this organization need that it doesn't have? Or where are the people who need what they have to offer? It's kind of a very simple question, no? But if you can start answering this question, and you see this question is already tingling in our brain or soul even, no? And by the way, this is also a key killer question for investors. No? You mentioned the investors who invest in 6 or 10 or 20 startups. If you cannot answer this question, then you have to go back to the drawing board. But there are ways to do that. I have formalized some more than others, but I think the key is always to, for example, also take this systemic attitude, which means you take a look at the entire system and not just at one cag or one area of the system, like understanding the mechanics, but you take a broader perspective and see how things change over time, how they are connected. No? That's, I think, the starting point. That's difficult at the beginning.
So now I would like to ask you, if you have a message for the world, what will be?
Yeah, maybe something counterintuitive. I would say first thing is, if you haven't started working with AI, then what are you waiting for, right? I do this every day. I discover new things every day and very helpful things. By the way, I experimented very early on to figure out if ChatGPT could do the work as a system modeler. And the short answer, it's not yet there, but there are good ways in how you can use it. Huh? Like, for example, do some quality assurance on models and solving some equations and things like that. So it's quite useful, but it's not a systems thinker in that sense. Okay, not yet. Maybe we come there. No? Secondly, I would say invest in your own capabilities. That's probably the best investment that you can make. And I believe, just speaking from my experience, investing in this systemic capabilities, in your own awareness and attitude, and also in your tool set, For example, the system dynamics tool set or what we can do now with AI is a really good investment which pays off over probably the next decade or two. There are already new things on the horizon, so don't worry. After agentic AI, there will be the next frontier, no question. No? But this is leading up to that. I would say invest in yourself and try out new things and see how you can solve things sometimes differently and maybe more elegantly with less effort, less pain.
Yeah, very interesting. I hope I don't tired with all my questions. I have the last one, and I hope you enjoy, the podcast too.
I do, yes. I love it, yes.
So the last question, Tom, it's how can companies build agility without creating chaos?
Agility without creating chaos. Okay. So agility is, you could say, on one hand, is about speed. If you are not moving fast enough, you're probably closer to dying than to living, I would say. So agility is about speed, but it's about also a way of keeping people connected and engaged. So I would say what I'm experimenting with right now, how I can, for example, work with AI to support agility, for example, in our approach of agile marketing. Okay. So we have, for example, weekly rhythms. How do we keep the team engaged, the client engaged, etc.? I think there's something that we can do better. How can we use tools? We, for example, in our organization have decided to standardize on the Zoho One suite. So we make heavy use of Zoho projects and Zoho sprints, which is a great way of a little bit more supporting or formalizing, if you want, your agility approach. No? And that's, I think, these are the ways moving forward. I find it increasingly interesting. For example, if you work, I was just working on a topic with Claude Code this morning and developing. I'm also doing some coding, yeah. So it's no question. But then I figured out, okay, it could help me to do things which I normally neglect, like writing the change log, writing the client briefing document, updating the requirements, etc. These are typically things which drag down the agility in the organization. Or if you have to do a lot of rework, which is, by the way, another interesting topic in system dynamics. No? We do work, we think it's completed, then it turns out it's actually not completed. So we have to go back and redo it. That's typically the disease of escalating timelines, schedules, and budgets. And I would say, okay, let's figure out how we can use AI in these projects to make our projects not only more agile, but to be on time, on budget, on scope. That's, I think, how I think about agility in project management and marketing also.
Thank you very much again. You take the time tonight to be with me, with all of us.
Pleasure.
And I'm very happy for everything what you share with us and many golden nuggets, if you want to say like that.
Yes. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. And I hope one or the other could make some use and get some ideas out of this. So good luck.
My name is Marius, and thank you for listening.